You want to go ahead and start that? Perfect. Thank you. So, hi everyone. I'm Karen Costa. I work in higher education in a variety of roles. You can find me probably on Twitter if you're looking for me. I'm here today in partnership with Online Learning Toolkit. And Judith and Melissa are here representing OLT. So they just gave their IRL waves to you all. Judith or Melissa, would you pop the OLT website into the chat for folks who might not be familiar with OLT? So many of you here today are connected with our Fall on Call faculty online community. And we're so happy to have you here. We love our Fall on Call learners. We also felt that there was a need for this content, so we opened it up to the public. So we also have some new folks here as well. I will give a little plug here for the OLT's Spring on Call. So if you're looking to connect with a really amazing, supportive, positive, fun, smart, just every adjective under the sun community, you might want to check out Spring on Call. Judith or Melissa, did y'all want to add anything about Spring on Call or OLT events or anything else coming to mind?
Yeah, our Spring on Call is going to start here in January, and we're opening it up to run all the way from January to August. And it's going to have a variety of things, live sessions like this, so mini webinars. We also have weekly sessions with each of the facilitators, which tackle very specific issues. And then we have some asynchronous modules that you can go through at your own pace. So it's really come as you are, and whatever you need, you can take it and leave the rest. So it's a great community of practice, like Karen said, and there's a lot of us here, and it's always so great to see our returning learners and of course our new ones. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. So I'll share quickly my motivation for hosting this, again, informal. I'll keep saying informal because I like to have, I do like to have, control things. And these more informal spaces are so important for me in my learning, but sometimes I do get a little anxious about keeping them informal. So you'll probably notice some of that, and I'll just be transparent about that. So my motivation for this was, I had a doctor's appointment a couple weeks ago, so I had to actually leave my house and drive somewhere. And I do a lot of thinking in the car, or I used to when I had a need to be in a car, right? I don't know if anybody else has that experience. And I was listening to, I think I was listening to actually Barbie Honeycutt's podcast. If you haven't checked out Barbie Honeycutt's podcast, it's awesome. And I was, having time to actually think. And I was thinking about the needs that I'm seeing in higher ed right now. And, is there something we could do at the kind of the end of the year for perhaps a pressing need that we're seeing in the field? And the thought that came to me was that I haven't seen a lot of content about supporting our ADHD learners. So I'm using that word learners specifically here because I'm hoping we can think broadly, not just about our students, but perhaps also about our kids, right? Many of us have become instructional coaches for our children. Maybe, supporting our colleagues and our leaders in challenges they might be facing. So hoping to start a conversation here. I've got a couple of resources and slides to share with you. I've got a nice little you're not leaving anything with me without a book recommendation. So I've got a few books next to me that I'm going to recommend. I have a TikTok video to share with you that I think is a really excellent depiction of what it's like to live with ADHD. I should also mention that I have a diagnosis of ADHD. So that's something that I live with. So I'm bringing that to this conversation. I am not a clinician. I'm not a psychiatrist. I want to be very transparent about that. I come to this from the standpoint of supporting faculty and students and learners from a pedagogical standpoint and from a student support standpoint and faculty development. Okay, so I thought we would do a quick check-in in the chat. And I'd like to invite folks to share one word or phrase that expresses how you are feeling in this moment. I like to keep it, this is one of my keep it simple check-ins. So one word or phrase, if you'd like to share in the chat, this is optional. You can also just watch. Okay. So I like this activity because it gives me a pulse on the room. And it always reveals things that I might not have expected. I'm definitely seeing certainly a trend towards some overwhelm. So I thank you all who shared that. I can tell you that you're not alone in that. We were talking as we were getting set up about what our holiday break will look like and how many days that will be and how many days until that day. This has really, we've been going, most of us have been going pretty hard since March. And before that. So for me, my last vacation was last December. So I'm really looking forward to this. I'm also seeing though a lot of curiosity. So that's fantastic. So thank you, inspiration and interest. So that's excellent. So the next thing I want to do is I want to start with checking in with your burning questions here about supporting ADHD learners. And we already had one. I'm going to paste that in the chat. Someone emailed us with a question. So I'm going to pop that in the chat to get us going about formatting text. We use a lot of written content in our online most of us, I think, are teaching online or at least partially online. So supporting ADHD learners with understanding written directions. So that's a great question that we can make sure we get to today. What other questions do folks have? So pop those in the chat. And I'd like you to also, after you write your question, I'd like you to look through the questions and perhaps see somebody who has a curiosity or a question that you either connect with, or that maybe you have some advice or a resource you can share with them. And perhaps just keep that person's name in mind as a possible connection for you in the future. So Jessica's asking, how do you get people to accept that ADHD is a true medical issue? That's a great question. I have thoughts and feels on that. Supporting ADHD as well as atypical students in a tutoring environment, which might in many cases be a one-on-one. If I'm understanding Susan, there's often a lot more one-on-one. Knowing when to push and when to give a break. Yeah, I'd like to know when to push myself and give myself a break. Anybody else? Lots of these will cut. We're going to talk today. One of the things I'll share is that one of the misconceptions is that everybody has ADHD. So we'll kind of break that down a little bit. But one of my contentions is that designing for ADHD learners makes things better for everybody. So that's our, what we call universal design for learning. So when I see Trail's question there, knowing when to push and when to give a break, right? Certainly that's very relevant for our ADHD learners. That's good for all of us, right? So that's something, a mindset we can keep in place, I think. Is it too distracting to suggest a side activity? My short answer is absolutely not. So if you ever hear weird noises when I'm presenting, I might be squeezing my little brain, right? That self-stimulation is really important. Kate, can I bug you to, Kate, didn't you have a fantastic link for, what were those called? You put them on your computer and you would calm strips. Thank you, Lillian. I had it. It was right there. This is what I'd like to do. I'd like us to share resources. Little tools like calm strips can be really helpful. John, ADHD versus PTSD. Compare and contrast. There's a lot of overlap and a growing body of awareness that there is overlap between ADHD and trauma, and very complex, very interesting, somewhat new. So we can touch on that too. Doodling as a tool, absolutely. I do see a theme here that I want to address. Right. So y'all, if you know me, you know that I'm pretty adamant that cameras should be optional in our courses. One of the reasons for that is that particularly for our ADHD learners, there might be things that they need to do in order to focus. And they might not feel comfortable doing those things on camera. So if we force students to be on camera and they don't feel comfortable doing the things they need to do in order to focus, we're doing it in the name of engagement. We might actually be disengaging those students. Awesome. Okay, so we've already started we've asked some great questions. I'm going to try to touch on these. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to bring us back to gallery view do want to say that because I think that's important. All right, I don't want to share that. I want to share this. Okay. This is probably one of the greatest anxiety inducing things that I do is sharing my screen because it's very detail oriented. Okay. So I'm going to give y'all a little bit of information. Let me pull up my chat as well so I can see that. And I have to pull up my notes, and I'm going to turn on captions as well. Yes. Did I turn on captions? Yes, I did. Okay. So a couple things that I think will be helpful, particularly for folks who are new to ADHD learning. I want to share with you just some definitions. So has anybody heard, and feel free to share this in the chat. I do have an eye on the chat. Has anybody heard had the question, well, what's the difference between ADD and ADHD? Has anybody wondered about that? So that's a really common. You might hear those interchangeably. It's kind of interesting. Jessica, yes, so that's a great question. Let's pause here. Jessica asked in the chat, can you turn the captions off? So yes, you can, right? Can folks turn the captions off in Google Captions? We don't know.
Karen, because you're sharing your screen with the captions on, only you can control them.
Okay, so Jessica, what I would suggest is to take a look at it and then maybe minimize the screen and just listen, if that might be a good workaround for you. So ADD and ADHD are often used interchangeably. ADHD is what's in the DSM, the diagnostic manual that clinicians use. So it's changed over the years. There used to be separate. There used to be an ADHD and an ADD, and they've changed it multiple times, which speaks to how we learn new things about these concepts and we change how we approach them, right? So there's in the DSM, you'll find ADHD with 3 subtypes, which I'm not going to get into today, but you can explore that in more depth if you'd like. ADD has officially been retired from the DSM, but you'll often hear people use ADD. I have a book, I'll pull this up again, that I'm going to share with y'all. It's called The Gift of Adult ADD. And this is written by a psychologist. So she intentionally still uses the term ADD because she feels that it's still relevant. So even within the clinical field, there's different people who use different definitions, but technically speaking, the diagnosis is ADHD. But again, you might have folks say, I have ADD, or you might even hear clinicians refer to it as ADD. So here's the definition of ADHD that I resonate most with. There are others out there. And this is from, the author's name is Sari Solden. She's my favorite. I have some of her books here as well. This is sort of like the handbook. This is a really popular book in the field. It's called Women with Attention Deficit Disorder. And again, the author's name is Sari Solden, and she is an expert in ADHD. She's a therapist working with ADHD patients, and the definition you'll see on your screen is hers. So a couple important things to note here: lifelong. So one of the things you hear when people say, oh, I think I have ADHD, and that is very possible. In order to be diagnosed with ADHD, you have to have had symptoms in childhood. So if you've developed like distraction in later life, that might be because of stress or trauma. So I talked to y'all a lot about how trauma impacts our executive function skills. That is a completely normal reaction to trauma and very common, but that's not necessarily ADHD. Thanks for sharing that link, Melissa. So it's a lifelong condition. It is neurobiological. So it's relating to the chemicals in our brains. So dopamine is the neurotransmitter that is, if you go into the literature, that is getting a lot of interest right now. And the belief is that folks with ADHD don't have the same amount of neurotransmitters as other folks have. So the chemicals just aren't there to get things going in the way that other people might have things going in their brain. So it's happening at a neurobiological level. It is believed to be genetic. So it's very typical for siblings to show up with symptoms, and for parents and even grandparents. And they might not have had that formal diagnosis, but you can sometimes see those things there in the family line. And ADHD leads to multiple impacts, chemical impacts, communication impacts, and arousal differences. And the area of interest is really zoning in on that executive function system of the brain, which I'll mention in a minute. And many of you are familiar with exec function. So exec function, sometimes called EF, relates to working memory. So if I ask you to, for example, call something to mind right now. So for example, if I say to you, I want you to call to mind how you plan your week, what your time management strategy is. And then I'm going to continue talking, and I'm going to give some more examples. And then I'm going to ask you to sort of work with your idea of your time management system in your brain, and to maybe decide, do you use a planner, and do you do other things like that? For folks with ADHD, that working memory is very fluid and flexible. And sometimes it's harder for us to hold things in our working memory. So having things, for example, in writing or having checklists is really, really important. And if folks have other tips here that, as I'm talking, that you see, put them in the chat. Other hallmarks of ADHD is difficulty with both focus and concentration. So I use those specifically. For me, focus is the ability to get started. So for example, if you bring your learners into an online course and you move them into breakout rooms, the ability to focus in on whatever task you've assigned your learners in that breakout room is what I'm talking about with the word focus. So the ability to start a new task. Concentration is the ability to stick with things. So another example of that, I'll bring this, I wanted to make this inclusive of faculty and staff learners as well. For me to start grading, I'm working on grading right now, is focus. For me to stay grading is concentration. And I have tools that I can recommend that I use to help me do that. So I'm going to put in the chat. And if any folks have any other cool tools like this, please put them in the chat. One of the tools that is life-saving to me is called the One Focus app. I'm on a Mac. It allows me to set timers to keep me on track. And it blocks me from tempting websites like Twitter. So that is a tool I use to focus and concentrate. ADHD also impacts our decision-making. So when you think about students who need to decide whether they are going to, for example, play video games, or whether they are going to work on do their reading, right? So decision-making is impacted. Impulse control. So the classic model is kind of like blurting out inappropriate things in class, but sometimes just maybe not fully thinking things through and sharing, which can also be an amazing asset. And we're going to talk about assets and strengths in a minute. I like to believe that many of the things that I have blurted out have been helpful to people. Self-regulation is sort of the ability to notice what's going on inside of you, noticing your stress levels, and to adapt accordingly. And I mentioned already time management. So time management is really, really interesting in folks with ADHD. So sort of the ability to plan your week, to stick with that plan, to assess how long things are going to take. All of those play into time management. And what we see in folks who have ADHD is that all of these are challenges. And hopefully you can see how these would impact us, whether we are students or faculty or staff, or for our kids in K through 12, all of these can make learning in the formal school environment really challenging. Caitlin, absolutely. So another, I mentioned this before, everybody does not have ADHD. So that's, something I hear sometimes, which is interesting. If you look at your phone a lot, that does not necessarily mean that you have ADHD, although, you certainly might, and that's worth checking out. But ADHD is a really complex, and I'm going to show you a video in a minute, challenging, issue that really impacts people's daily lives on a regular basis. So it's beyond kind of that being hooked on our phones, and it shows up in really every area of our lives. I want to pause there. I'm actually going to stop sharing so I can see folks. So Any questions about like what we're talking about here? What ADHD is? I see folks have already shared amazing resources in the chat. I love this. Bullet journaling, the Pomodoro method. I believe there's like a tomato clock that comes with the Pomodoro method, which is kind of fun. And other apps, yeah, that you can use to block distracting websites. Awesome. Other questions? I'll pause here for a minute. I'll do the teacher pause about kind of what's going on with ADHD and how it shows up, or things you've observed in your students that challenges students. So we have multiple plugs for the tomato clock. I think it would make me hungry. I will share, speaking of planners, I'm very particular about planners, and I've also started and stopped about 7 million planners. This is my planner. It says weekly appointment book, and I'll show you to what extent you can see this. But what's really important for me, it has 15-minute increments. I can't use a planner that doesn't have 15-minute increments. So if a planner has like 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, it doesn't work for me, because if I have like a 9:15 appointment, but that comes in after I've already scheduled a 9:45 and I have to have the 9:45 above the 9:15, my brain cannot process that. So it's really important for me to have 15-minute increments. So if you or someone you love is looking for a planner, that's a suggestion I have. I'm going to talk about how we need to make things visible. That 15 minutes really helps me. Trail, did you want to come off mute and share that? I just noticed that's a great point.
Yeah, I think this is the same as kind of for other neurological things like autism, but it's not the same for everyone, you know, like some students are super hyper and some are not. Like my niece is not hyper at all, so she just gets sort of taken over here. And so yeah, just like one thing might work for one of your students and it's not going to work for the other one, I guess was my point.
Thank you. And that was that's exactly what I thought your point was. Right. So for those of us familiar with universal design for learning, one of the tenets of that is, you know, flexibility and choice and providing students with multiple means of engagement. So what works for me might not work for you. So I hear things like a lot of my ADHD students will have music on when they're studying. And I'm always like, how do you do that? If I have music that has words, I can't do anything. I can sometimes work with instrumental music in the background, or I've had my therapist recommended, like, it's called pink noise, as opposed to white noise. But I actually need like complete silence, which is hard to come by these days. So yeah, being flexible. And again, I talk about this in the trauma work, you know, making sure that we're giving people agency. So we're not telling somebody what works best for them, but we're maybe encouraging them to try things, and we're offering different options for people. I think is really important. I love this little side conversation about what types of sound we like to work with and how that works for us. I think that's really important. Okay. I'm going to share another. So I want to make sure that we're keeping in mind a strengths. This actually leads into my next point here. I want to make sure we're keeping in mind a strengths-based approach. So are folks familiar with the term neurodiversity? Let me know in the chat if you're familiar with this, or maybe if it's the first time you've heard it. Oh, I just scrolled and things came up really quick. Well, we'll be okay with that. So neurodiversity, if you're interested in learning more, that would be a great little Google scavenger hunt for you to consider the term neurodiversity. It's a really broad concept. It is really looking at quote unquote disorders like ADHD and autism as normal variations in the human brain. So yeah, awesome. So I'm seeing a mix of familiarity in the chat. So that's great. And if you have a different understanding of neurodiversity than me, please do share that in the chat, or if you have great resources for that. So an example of that, and I'm going to share my speaker's notes. I have a great link for y'all that I'm going to share in the chat. This is one of the my favorite things that I've read about ADHD. So this is a great website as well. It's ADD Attitude magazine. So this article that I just shared in the chat says we should rename ADD or ADHD. You can see I use that interchangeably too, instead we should call it VAST. VAST. So ADHD stands for attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, right? So this idea of a deficit in attention. So the idea that I have a deficit in attention is hilarious to me because I give my attention, and if you know me, you know this is true, to everything. I think everything is fascinating. I love to learn. I shower the world and learning with my attention, right? So the idea that I have a deficit of attention is kind of funny. What I struggle with is narrowing my attention when somebody tells me I have to. And if that person is boring, it is almost impossible for me to narrow my attention to that person. So a better term, this article that I shared argues VAST, variable attention stimulus trait. You can read that article if you'd like. It's really fantastic. But the idea is that it's not that we have a deficit of attention, but that our attention is much more fluid and flexible and open, which is why ADHD folks are often known as being incredibly creative. So keeping that in mind can sometimes be really helpful. Are we focusing on the deficit or are we focusing on the strengths? And that I think, again, I'm going to keep going back to this. If we design, this is kind of UDL, right? Within all of our so-called deficits, there are also strengths. And I think if we can choose what we focus on here, and we can help our ADHD learners really celebrate their strengths. At the same time, I do want to say that it's really helpful to name my challenges. I really can't stand the word deficit, but to name my challenges and to get appropriate supports. I'm seeing awesome resources being shared in the chat here. Lillian, absolutely. So that word disorder, the medical field uses it. I don't really get it. We know from positive psychology that people sort of live up to high expectations and that words are really important. So I like the idea of renaming things to have a more positive mindset. Okay, so I want to get to this is not what I wanted to share. I want to find, okay, I'm going to share this video with y'all. And I think I'm going to try to share this. This is from TikTok. Are people on TikTok? We were talking about this before. I'm a TikTok lurker. I do not create any content, so I don't want you to get excited that you're going to see me dancing on TikTok. But I do like TikTok just for kind of humor. And there's a lot of people talking about mental health issues and challenges with ADHD on TikTok in a really kind of clever way. So I thought I would share this with y'all. Okay. My volume. Oh, you know what I have to do? I have to take my earphones out. Okay. All right. So we're going to play this video here. Oops. No, we're not. Come back. Here it is. I might have to stop my share and reopen.
ADHD is not, I'm going to write this email. Oh, look, a squirrel. It's more like, I'm going to sit down and write this email. Wait, I should probably brush my teeth before I do this. But now that I'm in the bathroom, I'm realizing that I forgot to take my medication. So now I'm going to take my medication. So I get my little pill cutter out, but then I realize I don't have anything to take my medication with. So I have to go downstairs and get a cup. As I'm getting a cup, I realize that I haven't made any coffee yet. So now I need to make coffee. And then I look over at the dishes and I see that they're dirty, which somehow reminds me that I need to do a load of laundry. So I go downstairs and do a load of laundry, come back upstairs, completely forget what I'm doing. But don't worry, coffee has a smell. So I remember that I was making coffee. Finish making my coffee, realize we don't have creamer. Oh crap, I should make a note that we need to go get creamer at the grocery store. No, wait, focus, gotta go upstairs. Take my pill with my coffee, but leave my coffee in the bathroom. Still gonna brush my teeth. Get back to the office, sit down to write that email. What the heck was that email about? I don't know. Oh, by the way, I'm still not wearing pants. And instead of doing anything, I'm gonna make a TikTok. All right, let's clarify something.
All right. So I wanted to kind of open up a conversation with that video. Yeah. I'm seeing comments in the chat. When I had the same reaction when I saw that. So as we're thinking about supporting whatever population you work with, whether it's students, faculty, staff, if we look at that as an example of what a 5-minute span of life is for someone who lives with ADHD, what are some challenges that they might encounter in an online course or in a meeting with colleagues or in a faculty development session? What do folks think? And feel free to come off mute and share, or you can write in the chat. But I thought that was a really powerful video and that maybe we can use it as a jumping off point. I can relate. That was accurate. Jack, maybe say a little bit more about what boring means to you. Anna saying the ability to prioritize. John saying knowing what's optional and what's required.
Basically,
in an online course, knowing where to start, how to navigate. Completion of tasks, Lisa says. So this monotonous videos of one person, right? So what is it like? Let's, if we use that woman who created that TikTok video for us as an, oh, I do. I like to model what this is. This could have been a TikTok video. Let me plug my earphones back in, y'all. Did someone come off mute and want to share?
Yeah, Jack would like to share, I think.
Thank you, Jack. And thank you, Kate. Go ahead, Jack.
Oh, great. Now,
I can hear you.
Now I'm the center of attention. Yeah, the problem tends to be because I either think very quickly or jump to conclusions, depending on how you want to define it. I find myself moving ahead of where the discussion is. And that's basically been my entire adult working life. So I have to keep pulling myself back to what's being discussed because I'm already over there, and I've got to. So I've kind of developed this tape loop in my mind where I'm kind of paying attention to what people are saying, and then if I need to do something, then I replay it and come back in. That's not the greatest method of dealing with it, but it's mine.
Jack, that's very relatable to me. And I thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you for coming off mute and sharing that. Let's thinking about that for our learners. So the ADHD, I sometimes, and you'll see this in the literature, turbo brain. So again, the idea that there's a deficit there is really interesting. ADHD learners are thinking very quickly, and they're making connections between ideas very, very quickly. And so an example of that helps me is I like having a back channel. So and what I mean by that is, for example, in a Zoom meeting, the presenter is talking about X, but I can be in the chat and I can be saying, oh, what does everybody think about Y? And what does everybody think about Z, right? And having a presenter that encourages encourages people to go in directions and to freely chat and engage and share resources. I was doing that. I was in a 9 o'clock meeting. And it was the kind of space that was inclusive for my type of thinking, and allowed me to go in several directions. That helps me. Strangely enough, talking about other topics helps me focus on the topic at hand. So there's, when I see folks trying to police students' attention, I think it's really important that we notice that not everybody processes things in the same way. So what might look to you like not paying attention or going off on a tangent is actually how folks with ADHD might be keeping their focus. And I would add that Jack and I are coming up with some really interesting creative ideas that maybe would be fodder for future assignments or for future discussions. And folks like Jack and I, is there a way to capture those ideas and celebrate those? So that's fantastic. What other things come up for y'all when you think about that woman's TikTok and how that might show up in our online courses or in our online meetings, or or in any work that you do?
Well, I was thinking that poor woman.
Hi, what is your name? Would you introduce yourself?
Oh yes, sorry.
It's okay.
My name there. So my name is Riola Lasso.
Hello, Riola. Nice to hear from you.
Thank you. Hello to everyone. What I want to say is that I was paying a lot of attention, probably because my own ADHD, to the women, and I was thinking about her social environment. I thought, oh my God, she doesn't have anyone to help her, and now she's doing all of that stuff. So I ran into, her circumstances, and then I thought, oh my goodness, with all of that work, a poor one, I was just kind of empathize to her life. So what happened is that when I'm teaching to adult, especially Latino one, which is the cultural part, there too, we are very much physical. We talk with the whole body, the face, the hands, and everything. And then we are so much in connection with life. We are talking about one specific topic, but we are bringing back stories and anecdotes and everything. So how much is a condition, neurological condition, is socialization, is habit, is the moment when they come to us as a learner. I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking about all of that. So it's my own condition. I want to share that piece as a teacher of adult.
Thank you. Thank you. And this is, we have an hour together today. So this is gonna bring up more questions and answers for all of us. And it is, it is meant to be a jumping off point in a conversation. Riola, when you were talking about the social environment and support, I shared a link in the chat that might be of interest to people. And I think it just came out. It's in that ADD Attitude magazine. The concept of they call it body doubles. It's really interesting. So sometimes folks with ADHD are able to stay focused on task when there's somebody else there with them also, and they don't have to be, they're just in the room. They're just physically in the room as a reminder that we're working now, right? So if we think about that for our learners, whether they're in a physical classroom, and for ourselves, whether they or we are in a physical classroom or online, an example of that might be like an open Zoom I just saw somebody say co-working space. Hey, everybody, we're going to get together and we're going to work for an hour. I've joined some online writing groups, and oh my gosh, for me to like, writing is one of the tough things because it's got to be self-motivated. In most cases, it's incredibly hard for me to start. When I go into a Zoom writing group and I have that accountability of my fellow body doubles, I churn things out for the hour that we're together. So having, that body double concept might be helpful to people. And it's also, we can create that for all learners, right? It doesn't have to be about, I'm giving you this accommodation because you have ADHD. It can be, we're going to have a working space for an hour. Another example of that is if you use breakout rooms in Zoom, having breakout rooms that are themed. So like, this is the chatty breakout room, and this is the breakout room if you have questions, and this is the breakout room if you just want to work with another person. So that's another way that we could design, and that's good for everybody, right? It's not just good for our ADHD learners. Great. I'm seeing a very active chat here. Yeah, we've lost some of that flexibility. I don't know if there's any librarians here. I love libraries. I love books. I love reading. I love just everything. You can see behind me that I'm trying to start my own library. But that was one of the spaces when I was in school that I would actually be able to get things done. And the amount of work I could get done in 2 hours in the library was so far beyond what I could get done at home. Just being in the visible, I'll share a slide in a minute, the visible reminder that it's time to work, and getting me out of that space and being around other people who are working was really helpful for me. So I think, if we've got little kids at home, working, if we can work alongside them or create like co-working spaces at home, but we can also do it perhaps virtually, is really important. Great. Oh, I see blue hands. Caitlin, do you want to come off mute and share out?
Sure, thank you. Here, let's see if I can do video if it's not too bad. I was
It
just
looks
thinking,
great.
yeah, and I can resonate with everything that you were just saying. It's, yeah, thank you. But specifically, like going back to the TikTok thing, I was just thinking about how that that train of thought and all those different things can make it hard for someone to even just get to class. To just like be sitting in front of a computer, and then once they're there, they're feeling behind. And then if they're put into breakout rooms, or if they're asked to do some activity, they feel like, oh no. And so it's like we've already lost them. So that was, I don't know, that was just like my piece, and just thinking about different transition activities, where whether it's like processing time, or just in the beginning, I don't know, breath work, stretches, something like that. So
Thank you so much for saying that. So yeah, I think it would be nice for us to acknowledge that, you know, I think this is true for, again, a lot of this is true for all learners, but for somebody that has ADHD, getting to class is a victory. I think getting to that appointment on time is a victory. Getting to that appointment at all is a victory, because it can be really tough to hold that kind of detail in our brains. And just keeping that in mind, you know, I've been an advocate for flexibility and structure. The other thing is I'm thinking about that cameras on, cameras off. Y'all know I'm pretty hard line, and cameras should be optional. But think about a learner who maybe didn't plan an ADHD learner who didn't plan their day, and they didn't have time to eat before their class, because they were doing what that woman was doing in the video, and they were, whatever was in front of them was the priority, because that's what the chemicals in their brain was telling them. And now they get to class, but they haven't eaten and they're starving, and they want to eat, but they don't want to eat on camera. And I don't want to eat on camera either. And I don't think you want to see me eat on camera. Not that there's anything wrong with eating on camera, but that's my feeling. Would I rather that student turn the camera off and eat their lunch, or would I rather them sit there and add hunger to their list of distractions, right? So forcing cameras on is truly just going against everything we know about inclusivity. It really is a diversity, equity, inclusion issue. It's not about, I don't want to see the black squares. Well, I don't always want to see the black squares either, but I want my learners to take care of themselves. I see another blue hand, and then I'm going to share a few strategy slides. Demetrius, did I get your name right, Demetrius?
Yes,
Hi.
yes, you did. Thank you. Hi. So I am a residence director, and so in dorms, and so in like sessions, so in training sessions, or in like meetings, there's like a departmental norm of like asking students to keep their cameras on as a way to like check if they're being attentive, or if they're paying attention, or, you know, engaging in like, I guess, the content or the material or whatever. And so I'm of the mind that, like, you know, the content of the meeting has to be structured to like keep folks engaged. So how would, you know, I be able to like integrate more inclusive norms, and also make sure that it sticks for my students and like for our department?
That's a fantastic question. First of all, thank you for all the work that you do. I used to work in judicial affairs, and we were closely tied to our residence halls directors. So I know that is a 24/7 job, and we celebrate you for all that you do. And I hope you're going to find time to get a break at some point this winter. I shared 2 links in the chat for you. The first one is called an article I wrote called "Cameras Be Damned," and it speaks to why being on camera isn't a good idea, for a variety of reasons, why forcing students on camera is a bad idea. The second one is called "Making Shapes in Zoom," and it touches on all the other things we can do to engage our learners besides forcing them to be on camera. So things like we're doing here, asking questions, not always using slides, getting folks engaged in the chat, inviting people to come off mute, using polls. I was just in a session earlier where they used something called Mentimeter. I don't know if anybody's using Mentimeter. I think I'm saying it right. It was cool. And I was like, I need to learn how to use Mentimeter. I thought it was a little cooler than the Zoom polls. a very simple strategy is asking people to, and let's just do this to test it out for the heck of it. So can y'all click on the participants tab? And you'll see a little green, you should see a little green checkbox that says yes, and you should also see one that says no. So go ahead and pick, you know, one of those to click on, and that is you can just ask yes or no questions. I'm getting, behind the scenes, I'm getting a count. So 28 of you are in a yes mood and 2 of you are a little contrary, and I celebrate you and you've selected no. So you don't have to do a formal poll. You can say to your students, how many of you agree, or your learners, how many of you agree with this new policy? How many of you have concerns? How many of you still have questions? And that's a nice little click to get people to do something rather than just passively listening. So those 2 articles, I think, Demetrius, will be really helpful for you. We absolutely want to design for engagement, but cameras do not guarantee engagement. I assure you that I can look like I'm paying attention, and I'm like writing a movie script in my brain, or I'm, you know, obsessing over something I said to someone 3 years ago, and I look like I'm paying attention, but I'm not. So the camera does not at all correlate with attention or engagement. And in fact, it can actually work against it. Because if it's increasing my stress, and I'm not getting my, you know, my physical basic needs met, I'm less likely to pay attention. So make it cameras are optional in this session, by the way, and I see a heck of a lot of faces, right? So when we take that pressure off, sometimes people will opt in anyway if they feel safe in that environment. Okay, I'm going to share a couple more. Keep asking and talking. This is informal, but I do want to share a couple of my suggestions. Okay, so I want to present that. So a few strategies that might be helpful to folks to keep in mind. So in higher education, I'm assuming most folks here are higher education. If you're K through 12, this might be a little different. Students and learners can get what we typically call accommodations if they have a formal ADHD diagnosis. The most typical accommodations are extended time. When we were in the physical classroom together, one of the common accommodations might be a separate room to help with focus. So certainly that is a path to support for our learners. And many of us have offices of accommodations or accessibility on our campuses to help with that. But we don't need to rely on formal accommodations to create more inclusive classrooms. So if you're not familiar with the UDL framework, Universal Design for Learning, Lillian, I don't know if you want to share your podcast in the chat. That would be a great resource for folks. We can design for accessibility. So we don't have to rely on students to say, I have a formal diagnosis and I need an accommodation. We can put some of these things in place to create more inclusive, accessible classrooms. Be very mindful of cognitive load. So I want to address that question that came into us via email about what's called the wall of text in our online courses. For folks who have attention challenges, the wall of text is like, forget it. When I read a ton of novels, but I also quit a lot of novels because if I see if the paragraph is a page and a half long, I'm like, this might not be for me, you know? So being mindful of using things like images or infographics to break up the huge wall of text can help reduce cognitive load. When I see assignments, have y'all seen this? And I've done this before. So if you're doing this, it's okay. But we're now seeing assignment instructions that are 2 or 3 pages long. That's an issue, I think, for cognitive load, because our ADHD learners are not even going to be able to get through the directions in many cases to actually do the work that you now want to assess. So simplify, edit, self-edit, shorten things up, keep it short, keep it simple. The other thing you can do is if you have a short assignment prompt, you can then link out to additional resources, but the prompt itself will be short so that it's not the wall of text, but keeping cognitive load in mind. Providing options for learners. But I also like to say, let's not overwhelm our students with options. So if you have an assignment and you give students 10 options, that can sometimes actually create issues. I also like to say, if you're going to give options, say, you know, this is the most typical option that learners have taken in the past, because sometimes that will be a cue for somebody who's overwhelmed to say, I can't even make, you know, we talked about decision making, right? Sometimes making the decision of which assignment to do can actually shut that learner down. So you can say, hey, I'm going to recommend option 1. I think most of you will want to take that, but here's option 2, 3, and 4. So keeping that in mind. Job and task lists. This might look like an infographic, incredibly helpful. Giving students or learners a suggested timeline. And if there can be visual elements to that, you can use tools like Canva. Here's what you should be doing on Monday in this course. Here's what you should be doing on Tuesday. For our online learners, this is so important, right? Because there's sort of this increased flexibility in our online courses because we may, but we might not be meeting synchronously. So giving them a suggested timeline can really help. This is really important. ADHD behaviors can often appear to what we might call misbehavior, right? So a student showing up late to class might not be because they're intentionally misbehaving. It might be because they're managing ADHD, and we don't need to know that, right? We can just give ourselves and each other grace and assume the best. And keeping in mind, John asked about this before, trauma looks a lot like ADHD. So keeping in mind that, for many learners, those are going to overlap and those are going to show up together. So we're going to see a lot of behaviors that look like ADHD that might be related to students who are experiencing trauma. I'm going to check on the chat here. I'd actually closed it, which I rarely do. Look at all these great look at all these great suggestions. Lillian's got a podcast for y'all. Trail's going to make an instructional video to support learners with assignments. Susan's recommending ahead.org, which sounds like an awesome website. Kate has been generous enough to share her syllabus. Lots of plus ones on graphics, infographics, and timelines. So those are awesome. Couple more tips that I use for myself and learners is to make it visible or audible. So what do I mean by that? When I use the One Focus app, a little circle comes up at the top of my screen and it's completely white. And as the time ticks away, it turns black. So I can see how much I set it for, usually 10 or 15-minute increments. That's what I'm able to do. So I can see when it gets about halfway, I say to myself, oh, wow, I've already been working for 7.5 minutes. I only have 7.5 to go. I can do this. So the visibility of that timer reinforces that. I'm not able to hold, it's hard to explain this, but I'm not able to hold time in my brain. So being able to see time helps. So use timers. Anything that we can do to make things visible and audible helps. Don't expect the time frame I think I recommend to folks is 10 minutes for attention spans. And this goes for anybody. It might even be less for learners with ADHD, but if you're using lectures, anything longer than 10 minutes is incredibly problematic for anyone with attention challenges. And you're going to lose your ADHD learners in particular. So if you want your lectures to be inclusive, you've got to chunk them up. If you're going to lecture. So we want to kind of shorten things up and make sure we're addressing folks' attention spans. Scheduling both tasks and appointments is really important. So I call it due dates and due dates. And I'm going to write that in the chat so you know what I'm talking about. So for teaching our students or our colleagues or our kids that it's not just the assignments due on midnight on Tuesday. That's the due date, right? When are you going to do it? DO, that needs to go in the old planner. Okay. So helping learners, we often schedule due dates, DUE, and we forget to schedule due dates, DO. So that's really helpful. I am a heavy, I'm not going to say the name, I'm going to spell it ALEXA user. And I know there are like surveillance and other concerns with those devices. And I appreciate folks' concern with that. I need to use those ALEXA devices to stay well. So I have them all over my house and they have been life-changing to remind me to do things. An example of that is, do you ever run out of shampoo and you think to yourself, I need to buy new shampoo? That for me can last 2 weeks because I'm not able to hold, I need to buy shampoo in my working memory. But if I'm able to get to a device and say, device, remind me to buy shampoo, I've got a chance, right? So that can be really helpful. Writing things down, pretty self-explanatory. And I'm gonna pull us off of slides in a minute, but I just want to remind folks, keeping in mind that ADHD learners have tons of strengths, creativity, making sure that we're acknowledging all of those strengths in the work that we do with them. So we have about 5 minutes left. I want to see anybody else want to raise their little blue hand or their IRL hand or share in the chat with questions or ideas. Oh, I do want to put these books up real quick. Sari Solden, Women with Attention Deficit Disorder. Women are very much underdiagnosed, and she addresses that specific issue. The Gift of Adult ADD by Laura Honos Webb, HONOS-Webb. This has a strengths-based approach. And then if you really want to, if you like journaling, this is called A Radical Guide for Women with ADHD. And this is Sari Solden again. So this is, and it has a lot of journal, and I like the word radical, and it's got a lot of great ideas there, but she specifically addresses neurodiversity, if you were into that idea. Susan, thank you. Yeah, my hope was that we would recognize that these strategies benefit everybody, right? Particularly as we're going through collective trauma and stress. This has the potential to make lives better for everybody, right? So, being inclusive, that UDL mindset is really important, and it'll help us all. Thank you for that. Jack, we kept it really informal today, so I'm going to encourage folks to use their good friend Google. If you have questions, let me put my Twitter handle on here. And Judith, would you share the OLT website again for folks who maybe came in late? So for additional support, the OLT website is a great resource, and there's communities and webinars there. You can reach me on Twitter. I'll also pop my email into the chat. I'll be fully transparent that email is, I have to set limits with email, so I'm not always able to get back to everybody when I want to, but I'll pop it in the chat if folks have questions.
And when we post, everyone, we will post the resources that got shared today. So look for the link and then the resources as well. Yeah, and I can give you all the slides too to share. Great. And y'all will post it. It'll go on the OLT. You'll post it on the OLT website, and we're going to post it in Fall on Call, right? Yeah. So we're at, how are we at time? That's, well, I don't track time in my brain. When I'm doing something I love that's fascinating, there's, and some of you all might experience that flow state where time, it's a second. We've been here together for a second. So I want to just kind of charge people, let's keep this conversation going. I haven't seen a lot of resources being shared on supporting folks with ADHD, whether it's learners or coworkers. I think it can make things better for all of us if we start having this conversation. So let's tweet about it. Let's talk about it at our next department meeting. Let's do what, let's share resources as we're wrapping up in the chat. Demetrius shared CHADD, CHADD, amazing website, tons of amazing online communities to support folks. Thank you all so much for being here. We're at time. We will keep this conversation going. This is obviously a part of my life, whether I like it or not, and a passion point for me. So I'm gonna keep working on this, and let's all keep sharing and supporting each other and exploring this. Thanks so much for being here today, and let's stay in touch. It was great to chat and learn with y'all. All right. Thank you, Karen. This was wonderful. And on behalf of the Online Learning Toolkit, we are so glad that you did this for us and with us and offer this incredible resource to everybody. And thank everybody for coming. And join Spring on Call. It's a great faculty support community if you haven't thought about it already, with amazing resources. All right. I'll see some of you all in the coming days. Nice to meet the new folks. Anne, I love your hair. I see you, Anne Fancy. Good to see you. Bye, everybody. Bye. Have a great week. Take care.